Captain Michelle Davis had just wrapped up another 14-hour day at the precinct. It was the kind of day that left her exhausted but proud. She had been managing a high-profile case for weeks, balancing her role as one of the most respected police captains in the city, the constant pressures of being a black woman in law enforcement. In a male-dominated world, Michelle had climbed the ranks, overcoming every obstacle with grace, resilience, and an unwavering sense of justice. She had no illusions about how the world saw her, especially people like Officer Kyle Richardson. It was a humid summer evening, and the heat seemed to cling to everything like a second skin. Michelle's black SUV glided through the empty streets of the affluent suburban neighborhood she had lived in for years. Her mind drifted to thoughts of her son's upcoming basketball game. A pang of guilt hit her. She hadn't been home much lately. The work never seemed to end, and sometimes it felt like there wasn't enough of her to go around. As Michelle approached a quiet intersection, she noticed the glare of headlights in her rearview mirror, too close for comfort. A police cruiser tailgated her, its lights flashing brightly in the night. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She was well under the speed limit. Her vehicle was registered, her license up to date, but when the cruiser's lights flicked on, a strange knot formed in her stomach. "Seriously?" she muttered under her breath, pulling over to the side of the road. Her training kicked in. Even though she knew the drill well, she kept her hands visible on the wheel, watching the rearview mirror as the officer stepped out of his car. A streetlight illuminated him, casting his figure in a menacing shadow. It was Kyle Richardson. She had seen him around the station before, always with that smug look on his face. He wasn't one of her officers, but his reputation for crossing the line with suspects, especially minorities, was well known. Michelle's heart raced, not with fear, but with the familiar anticipation of what might come next. She had been on the receiving end of these encounters before. Never ended well. Richardson approached her window slowly, his hand resting on his holstered gun, his other hand already tapping impatiently on her window. The aggression in his body language was unmistakable. Michelle rolled down the window, her face calm but wary. "License and registration," Richardson snapped, not even bothering with pleasantries. Michelle, always careful, handed him both items with steady hands. "Officer, may I ask what this stop is about?" Richardson ignored her question, scanning the license as though searching for some hidden crime. His lip curled. "Suspicious behavior," he said flatly. "A vehicle matching this description has been reported for erratic driving." Suspicious behavior? Michelle knew the streets had been empty. She hadn't been speeding or driving erratically. Something wasn't right. Suspicious behavior? Michelle knew the streets had been empty. She hadn't been speeding or driving erratically. Something wasn't right. Erratic driving? "Officer, I'm a police captain. I know." Michelle started, but Richardson cut her off. "Oh, don't try that with me," kissed, face inches from the window. His tone was dripping with disdain. "You're not above the law, no matter what badge you flash." Her pulse quickened. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he emphasized "you." He knew she was a captain. He knew who she was, and yet he was treating her like a criminal. "Officer Richardson, I'm not challenging your authority. I just want to know why I've been pulled over," Michelle said, her voice firm but measured. "I told you," Richardson said, leaning closer. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. I have the right to stop anyone I deem suspicious." Michelle's mind raced. Richardson was escalating for no reason. She knew this tactic too well. He wanted control, he wanted submission, and when he didn't get it, he pushed harder. She had seen him do it before, but never up close like this. Richardson's hand hovered near his gun, his fingers twitching with impatience. "Step out of the vehicle," ordered, voice dripping with malice. Michelle's stomach dropped. This was no longer just a routine stop. It was personal. The tension between them thickened, the air crackling with unspoken danger. She had to keep calm. Years of police work had taught her how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. But there was something different this cold, hard reality of being both a black woman and a police officer hit her like a freight train. "Officer, this is unnecessary," Michelle said, carefully choosing her words. "If you run my license, you'll see who I am. There's no need for this." Richardson didn't budge. His eyes glinted with something darker, something far more dangerous than simple arrogance. He didn't care who she was. In this moment, it wasn't about the law. It was about power. I said, "Step out of the vehicle," he barked, his hand now gripping the handle of his gun. Michelle's pulse hammered in her chest. Outwardly, she remained calm. He had no choice. Slowly, she reached for the door handle and opened it, stepping out into the warm night air. Tension was palpable, a thick, suffocating presence that hung between them. As she stepped out of the car, the world seemed to shrink around her. Quiet suburban street was now a stage. The tension between them, the main act. Richardson stood tall, his chest puffed out in a display of dominance, while Michelle remained poised, every movement deliberate. She knew all eyes were on her now, even if they couldn't see it. Erratic driving? "Officer, I'm a police captain, I know," Michelle started, but Richardson cut her off. "Oh, don't try that with me," he hissed, his face inches from the window. His tone was dripping with disdain. "You're not above the law, no matter what badge you flash." Pulse quickened. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he emphasized "you." He knew she was a captain. He knew who she was, and yet he was treating her like a criminal. "Officer Richardson, I'm not challenging your authority. I just want to know why I've been pulled over," Michelle said, her voice firm but measured. "I told you," Richardson said, leaning closer. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. I have the right to stop anyone I deem suspicious." Michelle's mind raced. Richardson was escalating for no reason. She knew this tactic too well. He wanted control. He wanted submission. And when he didn't get it, pushed harder. She had seen him do it before, but never up close like this. Richardson's hand hovered near his gun, his fingers twitching with impatience. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, voice dripping with malice. Michelle's stomach dropped. This was no longer just a routine stop, it was personal. The tension between them thickened, air crackling with unspoken danger. She had to keep calm. Years of police work had taught her how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. There was something different this time. The cold, hard reality of being both a black woman and a police officer hit her like a freight train. "Officer, this is unnecessary," Michelle said, carefully choosing her word. "If you run my license, you'll see who I am. There's no need for this." But Richardson didn't budge. His eyes glinted with something darker, something far more dangerous than simple arrogance. He didn't care who she was. In this moment, it wasn't about the law. It was about power. "I said, step out of the vehicle," he barked, his hand now gripping the handle of his gun. Michelle's pulse hammered in her chest, but outwardly she remained calm. She had no choice. Slowly, she reached for the door handle and opened it, stepping out into the warm night air. Tension was palpable, thick, suffocating presence that hung between them. As she stepped out of the car, the world seemed to shrink around her. Quiet suburban street was now a stage, the tension between them the main act. Richardson stood tall, his chest puffed out in a display of dominance, while Michelle remained poised, her every movement deliberate. She knew all eyes were on her now, even if they couldn't see it. "What's this really about, Officer Richardson?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "We both know this stop doesn't make sense." Richardson's face twisted into a sneer. "What it's about," he said slowly, "is you thinking you're better than the rest of us. That badge doesn't give you special treatment." His words hit like a punch to the gut. Michelle had spent years fighting for equality, not just in the streets, but in the system itself. And now, standing before her was the very embodiment of everything wrong with the system she had sworn to protect. Before she could respond, another police cruiser pulled up behind Richardson's. Backup had arrived. 2 more officers stepped out, but this time Michelle recognized one of them, Officer Jenny Martinez, a junior officer who had just joined her precinct. Martinez's eyes widened in shock when she saw who was standing in front of Richardson. "Captain Davis?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michelle gave a small nod, her eyes still locked on Richardson. But now, something shifted. Martinez's presence brought a new layer of tension to the already volatile situation. The power dynamic was changing, and Richardson knew it. For a brief moment, Richardson's face faltered. His bravado cracked, just enough for Michelle to see the fear beneath it. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his grip on his gun tightening. "She was resisting," Richardson said sharply, his voice directed at Martinez and the other officer, as if trying to justify his behavior. "She was acting suspicious." Martinez frowned, glancing between Michelle and Richardson. "Captain Davis? Suspicious?" The disbelief in her voice was evident. The other officer, a tall, lanky man who looked fresh out of the academy, shifted uncomfortably. He clearly didn't want to be in the middle of whatever this was, but he kept quiet, deferring to Richardson's seniority. Michelle exhaled slowly, trying to maintain her composure. This had gone far enough. "Officer Martinez," she said, addressing the younger woman. "Run my plates. You'll see this is a mistake." Martinez hesitated for a moment, then nodded and moved toward her cruiser. Richardson's eyes followed her, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he might break a tooth. He knew his time was running out. "This isn't over," Richardson muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for Michelle to hear. "You think you can get away with this because you're a captain? You think I won't take you down?" Michelle's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of every word he was saying, the threat behind them. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about survival, about the lengths Richardson was willing to go to maintain control. Suddenly, Martinez returned, face pale. "Captain Davis," she said carefully, "your plates are clean. Everything checks out." Michelle nodded, the confirmation bringing her a small sense of relief, but the tension still lingered, thick in the night air. Richardson stood rigid, his hand still resting on his gun, as though refusing to accept the reality of the situation. "Then we're done here," Michelle said, her voice calm but authoritative. She turned to Richardson, meeting his gaze head-on. "I'll be filing a report on this, Officer Richardson. You crossed a line tonight." Richardson's face reddened with fury, his fists clenching at his sides. But he said nothing. Couldn't. The power had shifted entirely, and there was nothing he could do to take it back. Without another word, Michelle walked back to her SUV, her heart still pounding. The night had taken a dark turn, and though it was over, she knew the repercussions of this encounter would ripple through the department for weeks, maybe months. As she pulled away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Richardson stood there, standing rigid on the side of the road, his face twisted with barely contained rage. Officer Martinez and the other young officer exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with what had just transpired. The sight of Richardson in her rearview mirror reminded Michelle that this wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about the deep-rooted prejudices, the silent complicity, and the dangerous power dynamics that persisted even within the ranks she had fought so hard to climb. As she drove away, her mind raced. The anger simmered just beneath her calm exterior. Richardson had been reckless, aggressive, and clearly biased. It could have escalated so easily. The idea of what could have happened sent a shiver down her spine. She knew too well that, for so many black men and women, these encounters ended in tragedy. And if she hadn't been a captain? If it weren't for Martinez recognizing her in time? She pushed the thoughts aside and focused on what she had to do next. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. When Michelle pulled into her driveway, the house was dark, her family asleep. She sat in the car for a moment, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The weight of the night's events hung heavily on her shoulders. She glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, her eyes tired, face hard. This wasn't just about her. She knew she had to take a stand, not just for herself, but for every other person of color who had been victimized by people like Richardson. The next morning, Michelle didn't waste time. As soon as she walked into the precinct, she headed straight for her office. The atmosphere in the station was always tense. Being a black woman in a position of authority meant walking a tightrope every day. People looked up to her, but they also watched her every move, waiting for her to slip up. Today, though, Michelle felt a fire inside her. Richardson's behavior was unacceptable, and she was going to make sure it was dealt with. As she settled into her chair, she drafted a formal report detailing everything that had happened during the stop. Every hostile word, every threatening gesture, every moment Richardson had tried to intimidate her. When she finished, she attached the report to an email, CCing the police commissioner, the department's internal affairs division, and the civilian review board. Fallout didn't take long. Within hours, Richardson had been called into a closed-door meeting. Rumors swirled through the precinct like wildfire. Michelle heard snippets of hushed conversations in the hallways, saw the sideways glances from her fellow officers. Some were supportive, but others... She could feel the resentment simmering beneath their outward professionalism. It wasn't just about Richardson anymore. The unspoken tensions in the department, the division between those who believed in justice and those who believed in protecting their own, no matter what, had been laid bare, and Michelle was at the center of it. Later that afternoon, she was summoned to the commissioner's office. As she walked through the long, sterile hallways, her heart pounded in her chest. She knew she was making the right decision. That didn't make it any easier. She had spent her entire career towing the line, working twice as hard to be respected, to be seen as worthy of her position. Now, she was challenging one of her own, and the consequences could be far-reaching. Inside the commissioner's office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Commissioner Barnes, a gruff man with decades in the force, sat behind his desk, his face unreadable. Seated beside him were two members of the Internal Affairs Division, their expressions equally stern. "Captain Davis," Barnes began, his voice low and measured. "I've read your report. It's thorough." Michelle nodded but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "Internal Affairs has launched an investigation into Officer Richardson's conduct. This is a serious matter, and we take your concerns very seriously," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But you must understand the implications of what you're doing here. This will make waves. Department is already under scrutiny." "I understand, Commissioner," Michelle replied, her voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. If we allow officers like Richardson to act with impunity, we're compromising the very integrity of this department. Can't let racism and misconduct go unchecked." Barnes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "I agree, but this is going to be a long and difficult process. You'll face backlash, both within the department and from the public. Are you ready for that?" Michelle didn't hesitate. "I am." Commissioner nodded, though his expression remained grim. "Then we'll proceed. Richardson has been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation." As she left the commissioner's office, Michelle felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. This was only the beginning. The investigation would drag on for weeks, maybe even months. Richardson had his supporters, officers who believed in protecting their own, no matter what. She had already seen the way some of them looked at her, the way conversations would stop when she walked by. The invisible walls were closing in. Days passed, then weeks. Michelle carried on with her work, but the atmosphere in the precinct had shifted. Every day felt like walking through a minefield. Richardson's absence was conspicuous, but so was the growing divide among the officers. Some rallied around Michelle, quietly offering their support, while others avoided her entirely. The hostility was palpable. Then one morning, everything came to a head. Michelle was in her office, going over case files, when the door burst open. Officer Martinez stood in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide with alarm. "Captain, you need to come to the briefing room. Now," she said, her voice shaking. Michelle stood immediately, heart racing. She followed Martinez down the hallway, the sounds of hurried footsteps and anxious whispers filling the air. When they reached the briefing room, Michelle was met with a sight she hadn't expected. A group of officers had gathered, their faces tense, some angry, some concerned. At the center of the group stood Richardson. He had been reinstated. Richardson stood tall, his face smug, arms crossed over his chest. He met Michelle's gaze with a defiant smirk, as if daring her to say something. A knot of dread formed in Michelle's stomach, but she pushed it aside, refusing to let him intimidate her. "What is this?" Michelle demanded, her voice steady, despite the chaos unfolding around her. One of the senior officers, Lieutenant Harris, stepped forward, his expression grim. "Internal Affairs found insufficient evidence to pursue disciplinary action. Richardson is being reinstated to full duty." Michelle's world tilted. Insufficient evidence? How could they claim there was insufficient evidence when she had detailed every moment, every word, every action? The injustice of it all hit her like a tidal wave. She locked eyes with Richardson, her jaw clenched. He had won, at least for now. But this wasn't over. Michelle knew she couldn't stop here. There were other channels, other ways to fight this. But for now, in this moment, she felt the weight of the system pressing down on her, an unrelenting force that seemed determined to protect its own, even at the cost of justice. As the room buzzed with tension, Michelle stood her ground, her eyes never leaving Richardson's. This wasn't the end. Not for her. Not for the countless others who had been wronged by officers like him. What happened next would leave everyone speechless. But Michelle knew one thing for certain. She wasn't backing down. The fight had only just begun.